Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reflecting Our Global South Side, a project that through the Chicago Architecture Biennial, we're doing as a Matri-Archi collective with Craig and Cory Stevenson from Open Architecture Chicago. And we are going to start by introducing ourselves before introducing this wonderful collaboration. Matri-Archi is an intersectional collective that empowers or aims to empower African women, dedicated as a network to spatial education and the built environment in Africa. And we hand over to Craig and Cory to introduce their project.
Open Architecture Chicago is a part of Open Architecture Collaborative. It's a group of collectives around the United States who provide socially equity responsible design for communities that traditionally cannot afford them in the spatial environment.
We're super delighted to be collaborating, particularly because Matri-Archi is located between Switzerland and South Africa. Therefore, we're not in Chicago, but we're very interested in working as a collective, and that's what's brought us together here. A bit about our project within the context of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which is to do with the available city this year with the artistic director, David Brown. Our project is particularly rooted in the African continent and seeks to design spaces and evoke architectural discourses that reflect and archive overlooked cultures. Matri-Archi, our collective, really believes that such cultures can inform spatial environments through everyday spatial practices of routine, of occupation, of gathering, and of negotiation. We also believe that these everyday spatial practices don't just happen in our context, but happen amongst many different overlooked cultures across the world. And so reflecting our global South Side, happening on the South Side of Chicago, really tries to offer a space to house everyday interactions and to explore how occupation and reflection can facilitate learning about other cultures. And so we learn from each other, and that's what's brought us here today. Our project, as you will notice, as you've accessed through our QR codes, also invite you to engage in a virtual world of references that we've experienced in sub-Saharan Africa, and references that Craig and Cory, through their respective initiatives, have also experienced on the South Side of Chicago. And so when coming together with these references, we started going through some tensions that we've encountered, very much so looking at this theme of resistance. And perhaps I'll pass over to one of you by asking the question why we've chosen these references and why you think that Craig and Cory, our references speak to the ones that you've sort of suggested through our web platform.
Well, one of the things is that getting introduced to your project through David's work and you all's work, one of the things that stuck out to us mostly was that we had to do reflection. We had to realize that a lot of our informal economies now take place inside of formal businesses. We reflected back on in the sense that there's been 30 years of disinvestment on the South Side of Chicago since Harold Washington's death. And since that period of time, or probably even before that, there's been sort of like these, there's redlining, there's been this spatial politics that has been taking place. But there are now like street vendor laws, right? There are street vendor laws in which people can't sort of group or coagulate around similar economic practices on the streets of Chicago. And there are street vendors here, but then they are, it's almost like a sort of informal pass, right? Like they're understanding by the individual aldermen. There's 77 wards here, and so some of these wards all operate differently in the city of Chicago.
I think what is very interesting about this dialogue that we're trying to bring up with the images that we're putting up within the pavilion is that it's a very mistaken belief that globalization is a path towards a utopian world where everything must be developed and to a certain degree of what society considers developed or not. Globalization is kind of us continuously asking ourselves, who are we? Unfortunately, very few times can we understand that we, that other, that us that is there. We've learned so much from your context, and we're also hoping to bring in a light from our exposure to another context on the African continent that is also trying to give dignity to the informal. And this is where we can even start a quick exchange on how you see the informal within Chicago's South Side and how we have perceived the informal and how the responses can interact with each other.
We sort of also don't like to conform to the dominant understanding of informality because it's really got connotations of negativity. It's got connotations of being invalid, in a sense, not able to conform to the Western epistemological way of thinking. And so these overlooked types, these overlooked typologies are what we're interested in. And we're using informal as a surrogate term to really define something that we think is super important.
Well, I think that's why it's important for us to have this particular conversation, because I think so much can be loaded with word choice in terms of formal. And really it becomes a conversation of what is by design and what is culture and what is, should be showing up on the surface. And so I think that's why this conversation was very important to have, because even when we were seeking out to collaborate, we had to go beyond what was seen on the surface. Like, okay, what if it's not if it doesn't directly look like the culture that you want to bring out and expose to us over here in Chicago, then where is the connection? And the connection often has to be looking above, and how do we resist being set with a design? This is how you have to show up, or this is the way we want you to show up. And this is how you resisted that in that particular place.
I think it's a question about what's being centered. And I think a lot of times only white culture is centered as the norm. And in many cases, what is not the norm are these sort of emergent practices that we are continuously having in Black culture, right, across the diaspora. Like that is our sort of normality, right? And I think sort of like this false comparison of having to compare ourselves to what is taking place outside of our communities will always produce this sort of false binary. It's also sort of framing our imagination in a limited way.
When we thought of, bringing in these references, we really wanted to emphasize that there are mutual and red threads, even if they're not, comparing apple to apple, but rather discussing how our lived realities really speak to each other in terms of how communities who are not afforded the space to do things on their own terms create spaces where those terms can exist. And what we found really interesting about your references is that those things happen in spaces that are unexpected to us because of the climate conditions that are in Chicago, as you mentioned before, that a lot of these things happen in informal conditions, but the mutual or red thread between how we live both far and near as a wider community in these various South Sides is really determined by just a willingness to occupy and exist in spaces on terms that we create for ourselves, and that often communities outside of our communities also benefit from.
So, and a lot of the time, informal as a form of defiance is a form of defiance according to the issue of rent, right? So a lot of people cannot rent spaces, so you end up occupying the street in order to be able to make an income without having to pay. And one of the things that gives us the opportunity to have is an intensely social, culturally rich environment, in the sense that people talk, walk, and have a conversation on the street. And when we want to do a direct comparison in terms of what can be learned from our context and is an issue here currently within the European context, this informality that we have is not only defiance in terms of this capitalist society, but it also allows for a social, culturally rich context.
And we can only speak from our own point of view of experience, of shared experiences, and this growing tribe of physically displaced individuals with very culturally rich identities within the African continent, because it is a continent with 54 countries, with completely independent reasons for being informal and for this informality to be represented. And on purpose, we did have a mix of this into the references that are shown. But the idea behind it is that it's a form of resistance through the cracks. And this is also the future of not being able to mask or control the masses within how a natural life happens. So within an organic system of a city of globalization, as the population is increasing everywhere in the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in Americas, it's all very present everywhere. So you would find the same language, you would find this way of relating to this form of resistance through the cracks, of finding joy, in finding strength, in being what you want to do. And if you want to cut hair, you're going to cut hair. You're going to find a way to cut hair. If you want to be, you want to sing, you're going to find a way to sing on the streets. You're going to find a way to produce your art. You're going to find a way to represent and live and be, no matter how society removes that dignity from you or not. So this globalization is not only just for the Black community. It's actually a trait that we are taking the narrative and the point of view of Black community, let's say, within the African continent. So how that resistance happens, but it happens everywhere. And it's something to actually start changing the point of view of how we see that, and actually start seeing the value in how people take the strengths out of the little that they have in order to make the best out of it and to come out stronger. And that's empowering to us, no matter who you are.
We, as spatial practitioners, people concerned with space, both kind of stretched between margin and center, the center being that of traditional spatial education, which as a collective, we're also very interested in learning from you, learning from everyone who occupies the space on site, everyone who occupies the virtual space, is that we by no means want to romanticize the often undignified conditions of informality, but we do want to emphasize that there is a social, a non-monetary often value that comes from these very sophisticated systems that take organization, they take group cooperation, and they take a lot of trust, because there are no contracts sometimes. There are no formal processes that happen, but there is a collective will to improve the way in which we occupy space. And so we're very inspired, for example, by how braiding in the streets, as a simple example, something that has also informed the design of our benches, which we think is a really beautiful way of weaving and crafting, but how something like braiding in the streets for many Black women is a way to also understand and observe their surroundings just by virtue of getting a service done. And that's the case in many sub-Saharan African contexts. And we find that there are really interesting ways in which we start to engage in safe spaces, we start to engage in social spaces by congregating around our not so recognized community organizations. Perhaps we could reflect on the term reflect. We're not necessarily trying to find solutions, but what we are trying to do is reflect the reality, reflect the intangible through conversations like this. And we do hope that the dialogues or the juxtapositions that we've put onto this virtual world ignite these kinds of dialogues that allow us to not just reflect by ourselves, but also reflect under our mirrored little shelter on the world that is far and near that we occupy. And just wanted to hear your thoughts on what you think of this act of reflecting collectively.
Just, looking at you all's work and listening, is that I feel like it's more of a tapestry than that sort of these, if it's come a juxtaposition. I do a lot of cross stitch, and excuse me, because Cory and I started off as animators and storytellers first, and then we moved into the spatial space. So I'm just gonna start talking comic book language or whatnot, just because I'm really big into Pablo Escobar's pluriverse, and this idea of the multiverse is kind of popping up in these different universes. Always being present, right? And it's sort of like where we in Wakanda, I see Wakanda in the chat. Yeah. Well, where we focus on, right? Like where are we concentrating on? I think when you talk about I'm big into mindfulness practices, right? And so like when you're talking about reflecting and watching what is occurring, things are always popping in and out of the surface, right? Into people's awareness. And I think one of the things that's pretty special about David's project, The Available City, is like, I always take that as an inner statement about what's available within the people who are now having voice in this project. What's unique about this project is one, that we are in conversation, and David is very intentional about having this be a global conversation between practitioners, but two, that it's not just centered in the cultural center downtown in the city of Chicago, which most people consider to be the only, they consider like north of Roosevelt, right? Which the South Side really starts at Madison Avenue. So we really wanted to give you all things from like the South Loop, right? You know, we migrated from the South, right? Here in the States, right? And so we were actually positioned on two different sides of town, right? And that was very intentional. We started talking about spatial politics of the first wave and the second wave of the Great Migration. So one of those things I think about reflecting, this tapestry goes above ground, like if we're doing cross stitch, it goes above and then it comes back over, and there's all these things that are sort of like emerging. And I'm grateful that now we have sort of the technology, right? And we have sort of the ability to visualize these things and to capture it. Because I think we've been in conversations, right? And talking about our political views and reimagining the future and all these other things since as a people, we've been separated by the oceans, right? We've been in conversation. And so I'm grateful that, like, in terms of this project and reflecting the possibilities, the multiple possibilities, going back into the multiverse, I'm sure there's things that we won't be able to capture. But at this point in time, I always tell David, and I tell people that we in contact to, I was like, it's very rare. I don't know, like all of our peers are at this particular age, and I'm putting my peer grouping, are part of this biennial, right? And what does that mean if we continue to keep having these conversations and keep practicing and keep being in dialogue over our lifetimes, and to be able to pass this legacy of building worlds together, I think is very important.
That resonates so much with how we think and approach this virtual space, how we also imagine people to engage with their South Side, our South Side. You know, these pronouns become important because by no means is this us showing up and showing something that is exhaustive. This is a growing tapestry, to use your words, of knowledge that we're so fortunate to be involved in. We're so fortunate to be involved with anyone who's watching this. And we do implore everyone to please use the hashtag Our South Side and capture that which you think should be reflected in this space. And it will go far, and it will also allow all of us to learn from one another. And that's really the beauty of the beginning, that we, you know, in the words of the recent Navillus issue, they have clocks, we have time. So our temporality is really something that is infinite. And it's a complete pleasure to be working together with you and with everyone who's behind the other end of the screen.